The little black girl asked, "Can I eat with you?" The billionaire's heart broke. 5 words. That's all it took to shatter a billionaire's world. James Wellington III had survived hostile takeovers, market crashes, and boardroom betrayals. He'd built an empire from nothing, transforming childhood hunger into adult power. But he wasn't prepared for the small voice that would pierce through $23 billion of carefully constructed armor. "Can I eat with you?" The little girl couldn't have been more than 7, her dark eyes holding a hope that should have been impossible given the holes in her shoes and the way her jacket hung loose on her tiny frame. She stood outside Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, watching through glass windows as James sat alone at a table meant for 8, picking at a meal that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. He should have looked away. Should have pretended not to see her pressing her small face against the cold window, her breath fogging the glass between their 2 worlds. Should have called security, or his driver, or done any of the 1,000 things that rich men do when confronted with inconvenient poverty. Instead, James Wellington III, a man who hadn't cried since he was 10 years old, felt something crack inside his chest. Because in that moment, staring at this child who had nothing but still found the courage to ask for companionship rather than money, he saw himself. Not the powerful businessman he'd become, but the hungry boy he'd once been. The boy who'd learned that being alone was safer than being disappointed, that walls were stronger than bridges, that success was the only antidote to shame. The little girl smiled at him through the glass, and James realized he'd forgotten what hope looked like. What he didn't know was that her simple question would teach him that the richest man in the room is often the poorest soul, and that sometimes salvation comes disguised as a child's innocent request for connection. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the best part of the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I do want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The polished conference table gleamed under LED lights that cost more than most people's cars. James Wellington III adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his Patek Philippe watch. 3 minutes until the acquisition meeting that would add another billion to his portfolio. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly, its steel towers reflecting his empire's reach across the Midwest. "Sir, the Yamamoto representatives are here," his assistant announced through the intercom, her voice carefully modulated to match the sterile perfection of his corner office. James nodded, though she couldn't see him. 42 years old, worth $23 billion, and still chasing the next deal like a man running from something he refused to name. His reflection in the window showed a face that magazines called aristocratic. Sharp cheekbones, steel gray eyes, and not a single line that spoke of genuine laughter. The boy who'd once dug through garbage cans for half-eaten sandwiches had been buried so deep beneath layers of success that James sometimes wondered if he'd ever existed at all. The meeting commenced with the usual dance of corporate chess. James moved through it mechanically, his mind calculating profit margins while his heart beat with the steady rhythm of a machine. When the Ohio manufacturing executives nodded respectfully, he returned the gesture with precise degrees of inclination. Enough to show respect, not enough to suggest weakness. Everything in James's world operated on these careful calculations, these measured distances between himself and everyone else. "Wellington Industries appreciates your patience during our due diligence process," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to command rooms before he'd learned to command his own emotions. "We're prepared to move forward with the acquisition." The papers were signed. Another victory achieved. Another competitor absorbed into his growing empire. James felt the familiar hollow satisfaction that came with winning, a sensation like eating cotton candy, sweet for a moment, then dissolving into nothing. Across the city, in Chicago's South Side where tourists never ventured, 7-year-old Destiny Johnson pressed her face against the chain-link fence surrounding the community garden. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday's school lunch, and the growling had become a constant companion she'd learned to ignore. The garden was locked. It always was, but through the fence, she could see tomatoes hanging heavy on their vines, their red skin promising sweetness she could almost taste. Her shoes had holes that let in the October cold, and her jacket, a donation from last year's church drive, hung loose on her small frame. But Destiny's eyes held something that cold and hunger couldn't touch. A spark of hope that flickered like candlelight in a harsh wind, persistent and somehow unbreakable. Destiny. Her grandmother's voice carried across the courtyard of their housing project, sharp with worry. Get away from there, baby. You know you can't be wandering off. Destiny turned, her small hand still gripping the fence. Grandma Rose stood in the doorway of their ground-floor apartment, her housekeeper's uniform hanging loosely on her tired frame. At 68, Rose Johnson had raised 3 children and buried 2 of them, and now she was raising Destiny alone on a salary that barely covered rent and utilities. I was just looking, Grandma, Destiny said, skipping back across the cracked concrete. The tomatoes are so pretty. Red like Christmas ornaments. Rose's expression softened despite her exhaustion. This child saw beauty everywhere, in broken glass catching sunlight, in pigeons strutting across sidewalks, in the way shadows danced on walls. Even hunger couldn't dim that light in her eyes, though Rose worried constantly that the world would eventually snuff it out. Come inside, sweetheart. I made some tea, and we can share that pack of crackers Mrs. Henderson brought by. Destiny nodded enthusiastically, as if crackers and tea were a feast. She'd learned not to complain about being hungry, not to ask for things they couldn't afford. At 7, she understood scarcity in ways that should have made her bitter, but somehow hadn't. Instead, she developed an almost supernatural ability to find joy in the smallest offerings, a shared smile, a found penny, the way autumn leaves crunched under her feet. Inside their small apartment, Rose poured hot water over a tea bag she'd already used twice. The furniture was donated, mismatched but clean, and the walls were covered with Destiny's artwork, crayon drawings of flowers and families and houses with smoking chimneys. In one corner, a small pile of books from the library waited like treasures. Grandma, Destiny said, settling onto the couch with her cup of weak tea, do you think rich people get lonely? Rose paused, surprised by the question. What makes you ask that, baby? I saw this man on TV. He had a big house and fancy cars, but his eyes looked empty. Like he was hungry too, but not for food. Rose studied her granddaughter's face, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to emerge from such innocence. Some kinds of hunger can't be filled with money, sweetheart. Destiny nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Maybe somebody should invite him for crackers and tea. Rose smiled, pulling the child close. Maybe somebody should. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythms. The wealthy in their glass towers, the poor in their housing projects, and between them, an invisible wall that seemed impossible to breach. But somewhere in the space between James Wellington's empty victories and Destiny Johnson's full heart, fate was already weaving the threads that would bring them together. Neither of them knew that tomorrow, a simple question would change everything. The rain had started without warning, turning Chicago's October afternoon into a gray wash of misery. James Wellington III sat alone at his usual corner table in Le Bernardin, the city's most exclusive French restaurant, watching droplets race down floor-to-ceiling windows that separated him from the world outside. His lunch, seared duck breast with truffle reduction, sat largely untouched, growing cold while he absently scrolled through acquisition reports on his phone. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Chicago's elite. Crystal clinked against china. Waiters moved like ghosts between tables, attending to every need before it was spoken. James had reserved the large table out of habit, though he always dined alone. The empty chairs around him had become comfortable companions. They never asked for anything, never disappointed him, never left. Outside, the October wind whipped through the streets with vicious intent, sending pedestrians scurrying for cover. James barely noticed. Whether it was something that happened to other people, people who rode buses and walked instead of being chauffeured in climate-controlled luxury. His world existed in a perpetual state of 72 degrees, insulated from discomfort by layers of money and privilege. Then he saw her, a small figure huddled against the restaurant's exterior wall, just beyond the reach of the burgundy awning. She couldn't have been more than 7, her dark skin gleaming wet from the rain that had soaked through her inadequate jacket. Her shoes, if they could still be called that, squelched with each small step as she pressed closer to the building, seeking shelter that the narrow overhang couldn't provide. James's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Something about the child's posture, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, made him unable to look away. She wasn't begging or crying or demanding attention like the homeless people his security team usually shooed away. She was simply existing, surviving, enduring. The little girl tilted her head up, raindrops catching on her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. Her gaze found the restaurant's warm glow, and James watched her eyes widen with wonder. She stepped closer to the window, her small hands pressed against the glass, and for the first time in years, James saw his world through someone else's eyes. The restaurant must have looked like a palace to her. Golden light spilled from within, illuminating tables draped in pristine white linens. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried silver trays laden with food that steamed and gleamed. Well-dressed patrons laughed and gestured, their jewelry catching the light like captured stars. It was abundance made visible, comfort personified, warmth and safety and plenty all wrapped in an elegant package. James found himself leaning forward, studying the child's face. She wasn't looking at the expensive decorations or the wealthy diners. Her gaze was fixed on something simpler, the food. He watched her throat work as she swallowed, watched her small hand move unconsciously to her stomach. The gesture was so subtle, so dignified, that it hit him like a physical blow. The little girl's eyes swept across the dining room and landed on James. For a moment, time seemed suspended. He stared into dark eyes that held no accusation, no anger, no resentment, only a quiet hope that took his breath away. She smiled then, a small, tentative curve of her lips that somehow managed to be both heartbreaking and radiant. And then she did something that would haunt James for the rest of his life. The child raised her small hand and waved. Not the demanding gesture of someone seeking money or attention, but the simple, friendly wave of one human being acknowledging another. As if they were equals. As if the window between them was merely glass, not an insurmountable barrier between worlds. James's chest tightened. His hand, still holding the fork, began to tremble. Around him, the restaurant's warmth suddenly felt suffocating, the abundance obscene. The untouched food on his plate seemed to mock him, each morsel a reminder of waste, of privilege, of the distance between having everything and having nothing. The little girl stepped closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. She looked directly at James, and he saw himself reflected in her eyes. Not the powerful businessman, not the feared corporate titan, but simply a man. A man sitting alone at a table meant for 8, surrounded by empty chairs and emptier victories. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear through the thick glass. But he could read her lips, could understand the simple question that would shatter his carefully constructed world. "Can I eat with you?" The words hung between them like a prayer, like a challenge, like a mirror reflecting everything James had become and everything he'd lost. The child's face was open, hopeful, innocent of the impossibility of her request. She saw a man with food and asked to share it. She saw loneliness and offered companionship. She saw abundance and requested not charity, but connection. James felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd spent decades building. His throat constricted, his vision blurred. The little girl kept watching him, waiting for his answer, her small hand still pressed against the glass that separated their worlds. Around him, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and consumption. Conversations flowed like wine. Laughter tinkled like wind chimes. The wealthy fed their bodies while their souls remained hungry, unconscious of the child outside who had everything they lacked. The courage to ask for what she needed, the wisdom to understand that sharing a meal was about more than food, the grace to offer friendship to a stranger. James Wellington III, master of the universe, conqueror of markets, builder of empires, sat frozen in his chair, undone by 5 simple words from a child who had nothing but somehow possessed everything he'd forgotten he'd ever wanted. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, while inside the restaurant, a billionaire's heart began to break open. James Wellington III jerked back from the window, as if the glass had burned him. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a reminder of vulnerability he couldn't afford. The little girl still stood there, rain-soaked and hopeful, her small hand pressed against the barrier between their worlds, waiting for an answer he couldn't give. "Sir." The maitre d' appeared at his elbow, his voice carefully modulated to match the restaurant's refined atmosphere. "Is everything all right? You seem distressed." James forced his breathing to steady, his businessman's mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "I'm fine, Philippe. Just checking the weather." But Philippe's gaze had already shifted to the window, his expression hardening as he spotted the child. "Oh, I see. Don't worry, sir. I'll have security handle this immediately. These situations are always unfortunate, but we can't have." "No." The word came out sharper than James intended. Philippe's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I mean, it's fine. She's not bothering anyone." Yet, James thought, even as the word felt like a betrayal. Because the truth was, she was bothering him in ways that made his chest tight and his hands shake. Bothering him with questions he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. Philippe hesitated, clearly confused by James's unusual response. In the 5 years he'd managed this restaurant, James Wellington had never once shown interest in the homeless population that occasionally wandered too close to their establishment. "Are you certain, sir? Our policy is quite clear about." "I said it's fine." James's voice carried the authority that had closed billion-dollar deals and silenced boardrooms. Philippe retreated with a respectful nod, but James could feel the man's curious gaze lingering. James turned back to his meal, stabbing at the duck breast with unnecessary force. The meat, once perfectly prepared, now tasted like ash in his mouth. He tried to focus on the acquisition reports scattered across his tablet, tried to lose himself in the familiar language of profit margins and market projections. But his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the small figure who hadn't moved, who continued to wait with the patience of someone who had learned that hope was sometimes all you had. "This is ridiculous," he told himself. "She's just a child. A hungry child, yes, but that's not my problem. I have charities. I write checks. I don't need to." But even as he tried to rationalize, memories clawed their way to the surface. Memories of standing outside bakeries as a 10-year-old, watching families share warm bread while his own stomach cramped with hunger. Memories of pressing his face against restaurant windows, dreaming of sitting at those white-clothed tables, of belonging somewhere warm and safe and full. He'd been that child once. Before the foster homes, before the scholarships, before the first million, and the second and the 23rd billion that followed. He'd been that small figure in the rain, hoping someone would see him as more than a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be removed. "No," James whispered to himself, his fork clattering against the china. "That was different. I was different." "How?" The question came unbidden, in a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own conscience. "How were you different?" He pushed the thought away with the force of long practice. He'd built an empire by making hard decisions, by understanding that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The world was full of hungry children, and he couldn't save them all. He had responsibilities, obligations, a reputation to maintain. He was James Wellington III, not some bleeding-heart philanthropist who... The child moved closer to the window, her small breath fogging the glass. She traced something in the condensation with her finger, a heart, simple and lopsided, and somehow devastating in its innocence. Then she looked directly at James again, and he saw something that made his carefully constructed arguments crumble. She wasn't looking at him with pity or judgment. She was looking at him with understanding. as if she could see through his expensive suit and his billion-dollar empire to the frightened boy still hiding inside. As if she recognized a kindred spirit, someone who knew what it meant to be on the outside looking in. She's not asking for money, James realized with a shock that left him breathless. She's asking for connection, for acknowledgement, for the simple human dignity of sharing a meal. The thought terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever had. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. Several diners turned to look, their conversations pausing as they registered his distress. He couldn't breathe. The restaurant's warmth felt suffocating, the golden light too bright, the gentle hum of conversation too loud. "I need to go," he told Philippe, throwing down his platinum card without looking at the bill. "Business emergency." Philippe nodded, accustomed to the sudden departures of his wealthy clientele. "Of course, sir. Shall I have your driver brought around?" But James was already moving, his long strides carrying him toward the restaurant's back exit. Away from the window. Away from the child. Away from the question that hung between them like a bridge he was too cowardly to cross. As he reached the door, he couldn't resist one last look over his shoulder. The little girl was still there, still waiting, her hand still pressed against the glass. But now she was watching him leave, her dark eyes wide with understanding that cut deeper than any accusation. She didn't call out, didn't cry or beat against the window or demand his attention. She simply watched him go, her small heart still traced on the foggy glass, and somehow that quiet dignity hurt more than any tantrum could have. James pushed through the exit into the alley behind the restaurant, the October rain hitting his face like a benediction. His driver was already waiting, engine running, ready to whisk him back to the safety of his tower. But as he climbed into the back seat, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was running from something more important than he'd ever run toward. The little girl's question echoed in his mind. "Can I eat with you?" And for the first time in 32 years, James Wellington III wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. James's black Bentley had barely made it 3 blocks from the restaurant when Chicago's October storm unleashed its full fury. What had started as a steady rain transformed into a deluge that turned streets into rivers and visibility into a dangerous gamble. His driver, Thomas, pulled over beneath an overpass, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against sheets of water that hammered the car's roof like an accusation. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington," Thomas said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's not safe to continue. The Weather Service is calling it a flash flood warning. We'll need to wait it out." James nodded curtly, though his mind was elsewhere. Even here, 3 blocks away, he couldn't escape the image of dark eyes and a small hand pressed against glass. He pulled out his phone, desperate for distraction, but the numbers on his screen blurred together like rain on windows. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The storm showed no signs of abating, and James found himself checking his watch obsessively, each tick a reminder that somewhere behind them, a little girl might still be standing in the rain. The thought lodged in his chest like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore. "Thomas," he heard himself say, "drive back to Le Bernardin." His driver turned in surprise. "Sir? But the storm." "I don't care about the storm." The words surprised them both. James Wellington III always cared about safety, about calculated risks, about protecting his assets. But something stronger than logic was pulling him back, something that felt dangerously close to conscience. The return journey took 15 minutes through flooded streets. When they pulled up to the restaurant, James's heart sank. The sidewalk where the child had stood was empty, the rain having washed away even the heart she'd traced on the window. She was gone, and he told himself the relief he felt was appropriate, sensible, the reaction of a man who'd nearly made a foolish mistake. "Shall I take you home now, sir?" Thomas asked. James was about to say yes when movement caught his eye. Across the street, huddled in the narrow doorway of a closed bookstore, he saw her. The little girl sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her soaked jacket wrapped around her like inadequate armor against the cold. She wasn't crying or calling for help. She was simply enduring, the way children learn to do when the world offers them no other choice. "Pull over," James commanded. "Sir." "I said pull over." Thomas maneuvered the Bentley to the curb, and James found himself stepping out into the storm before he'd fully decided to move. The rain hit him like a physical assault, soaking through his $1,000 suit in seconds, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the child, on the way she'd wrapped her thin arms around herself, trying to become small enough to fit entirely within the doorway's meager shelter. She looked up as he approached, and James saw no surprise in her eyes, only a quiet acceptance that made his chest tight. As if she'd known he would come back. As if she'd been waiting. "You're still here," he said, then immediately felt foolish. Of course she was still here. Where else would she go? "Yes," she said simply. Her voice was smaller than he'd expected, but steady. "The rain's too heavy to walk in." James stood there dripping, acutely aware of the absurdity of the situation. He was one of the most powerful men in Chicago, and he was standing in a thunderstorm talking to a homeless child. His board of directors would think he'd lost his mind. His competitors would smell weakness. His carefully cultivated image was dissolving as surely as his expensive haircut in the rain. None of it seemed to matter. "What's your name?" he asked. "Destiny." She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You were in the restaurant. You saw me." It wasn't a question. James nodded, unsure what else to do with the truth. "You left," Destiny continued, still without accusation. "But you came back." "Yes." The word felt like a confession. They stood there in the rain, an unlikely pair united by circumstance and something neither of them fully understood. James should have walked away. Should have gotten back in his car and returned to his climate-controlled world where children like Destiny existed only as statistics in charity reports. But something kept his feet planted on the flooded sidewalk. "Are you hungry?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Destiny's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering across her features like lightning. "Yes." The simple honesty of her answer hit him harder than any business presentation ever had. No pride, no pretense, no calculation. Just truth, raw and immediate and devastating in its purity. "The restaurant's still open," James said, nodding toward Le Bernardin's golden glow across the street. Would you like to have dinner?" He'd expected excitement, perhaps tears of gratitude. Instead, Destiny regarded him with that same unsettling intensity, as if she could see straight through to his soul. "Will you eat with me?" she asked. "Really eat with me? Not just watch me eat." The question revealed more about his character than James cared to examine. How many times had he thrown money at problems without truly engaging? How many charity galas had he attended where he'd written checks, but never spoken to the people he was supposedly helping? How many times had he confused giving money with giving of himself? "Yes," he said, and meant it. "I'll eat with you." Destiny smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. She stood, water streaming from her inadequate clothes, and held out her small hand to him. James stared at it for a long moment. Such a simple gesture, yet it represented everything he'd spent his adult life avoiding. Connection, vulnerability, the risk of caring about someone who couldn't benefit his empire. Her hand was small and damp and probably cold, and taking it would change something fundamental about who he was. He took it anyway. Together, they walked across the street through the storm, a billionaire and a homeless child, their hands linked against the rain. James felt exposed, terrified, and somehow more alive than he'd felt in decades. Behind them, his driver sat in the Bentley, watching in amazement as his employer did something that would have been impossible to imagine an hour earlier. Something that looked remarkably like choosing compassion over comfort. The storm raged around them, but for the first time in years, James Wellington III wasn't running from anything. He was walking toward something instead. The maitre d's face underwent a remarkable transformation when James walked through Le Bernardin's front doors with Destiny's small hand in his. Philippe's practiced composure cracked like expensive porcelain, his eyes darting between the billionaire and the rain-soaked child as if he were witnessing something that defied the natural order of the universe. "Mr. Wellington," Philippe managed, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional courtesy. We weren't expecting, that is to say." "A table for two," James said simply, water still dripping from his ruined suit. "Somewhere quiet." Philippe's gaze lingered on Destiny, taking in her threadbare clothes, her worn shoes, the way she stood close to James, as if seeking protection from the stares of other diners. The restaurant had fallen unnaturally quiet, conversations dying mid-sentence as Chicago's elite processed the impossible scene before them. "Perhaps," Philippe said carefully, "the private dining room would be more appropriate?" James understood the subtext. Hidden away where she wouldn't disturb the sensibilities of paying customers. Where this breach of social protocol could be contained, managed, forgotten. 6 months ago, he would have agreed. 6 months ago, he would never have been in this situation at all. "The main dining room will be fine," James said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. "Our usual table." "Our table." The word surprised him. As if this strange, rain-soaked pair had become a unit worthy of possessive pronouns. Philippe's professional smile never wavered, but James caught the flash of panic in his eyes. Still, the man was too well-trained to argue with a customer who'd probably spent more money in this restaurant than most people earned in a year. "Of course, sir. Right this way." They followed Philippe through the dining room, past tables where conversations resumed in urgent whispers. James felt the weight of every stare, every raised eyebrow, every barely concealed expression of shock and disapproval. Beside him, Destiny walked with her chin up, seemingly oblivious to the attention, her small hand still tucked trustingly in his. At their table, the same corner spot where James had sat alone an hour earlier, Philippe pulled out Destiny's chair with exaggerated courtesy. She climbed up, her feet barely reaching the floor, and looked around the restaurant with wide eyes that held wonder rather than intimidation. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with the same awe James remembered feeling the first time he'd eaten in a real restaurant, 32 years ago. A waiter appeared with menus, his expression carefully neutral despite the unprecedented situation. James watched Destiny's eyes grow round as she opened the leather-bound folder, her lips moving silently as she tried to sound out the French words. "What's confit?" she asked, pointing to an item that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a week. "Duck," James said gently. "Cooked very slowly in its own fat until it's tender." Destiny wrinkled her nose. "That sounds gross." Despite everything, the stares, the whispers, the complete upheaval of his carefully ordered world, James found himself smiling. When was the last time someone had been so refreshingly honest in his presence? "What do you usually like to eat?" he asked. Destiny's expression grew thoughtful. "Grandma Rose makes really good mac and cheese. But we haven't had that in a while because the stove's broken and the landlord won't fix it. Mostly we eat whatever the food pantry has. Sometimes crackers and peanut butter. Sometimes soup from cans." She paused, then added with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned to adapt. "Soup's better when it's cold outside." Each word hit James like a physical blow. Not because of the poverty she described, he'd lived that reality himself once, but because of the complete absence of self-pity in her voice. She spoke of hunger and broken appliances and food pantries the way other children might discuss their favorite toys, with simple acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. "Where's your grandma now?" James asked gently. "Working." Destiny's legs swung from the tall chair. "She cleans offices at night, so she can take care of me during the day. But today she had to work extra because Mrs. Patterson got sick and couldn't come in. Grandma Rose said I could wait at the library until she got home, but—" She glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. The library closed early because of the storm. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. This child hadn't been wandering the streets by choice. She'd been caught between circumstances, trying to find shelter until her grandmother finished work. The image of Destiny pressed against the restaurant window took on new meaning. Not begging, but simply seeking warmth and safety in a world that offered precious little of either. "Tell me about your grandma," James said, surprising himself with the genuine interest in his voice. Destiny's entire face lit up. "She's the best grandma in the whole world. She sings while she makes breakfast, even when there's not much to make. And she reads to me every night, even when she's super tired. She has the softest hands, and she always smells like that lotion from the dollar store. Lavender, I think. She says I'm her sunshine baby." The love in her voice was so pure, so uncomplicated, that James felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time anyone had spoken about him with that kind of unqualified affection? When was the last time he'd felt that kind of simple, unconditional love? "She sounds wonderful," James said quietly. "She is. She works really hard to take care of me. Sometimes I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep, but she always smiles in the morning. She says we're going to be okay, that things will get better." Destiny's voice dropped to a whisper. "I hope she's right." James's throat constricted. The child's quiet faith in a future that offered no guarantees, her trust in a grandmother who was barely keeping them afloat, her ability to find joy in crackers and peanut butter. It all served as a mirror reflecting his own spiritual poverty. He thought of his own childhood, of the foster homes where affection was rationed and love was a luxury reserved for someone else's children. He'd survived by building walls, by learning to need nothing from anyone. But this child, facing circumstances just as dire, had somehow maintained her capacity for hope, for trust, for connection. "Destiny," he said slowly, "why did you ask to eat with me? You could have asked for money, or food to take away. Why did you want to share a meal?" She considered the question with the seriousness of someone far older than her 7 years. "Because you looked lonely," she said finally. "Really lonely. Like maybe you forgot that eating with someone is better than eating alone." The truth of it hit James like a physical blow. In all his success, all his accumulation of wealth and power, he had forgotten. He'd forgotten the simple human need for connection, for shared experience, for the basic comfort of not being alone. A homeless 7-year-old had seen through his billions to the loneliness at his core. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of everything. "I'll have the chicken fingers," Destiny announced to the waiter, who looked momentarily confused. Philippe hurried over, whispering frantically about how Le Bernardin didn't serve chicken fingers, how their youngest preparation was perhaps the pan-seared halibut with. "Make chicken fingers," James interrupted quietly. "The chef will figure it out." Philippe's mouth opened and closed like a fish before he nodded and retreated. James turned back to Destiny, who was carefully arranging her napkin in her lap with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred ritual. "Grandma Rose taught me proper table manners," she explained, smoothing the linen with small, precise movements. "She says being poor doesn't mean being impolite." The simple dignity of the statement hit James harder than any boardroom power play ever had. He watched this 7-year-old child demonstrate more grace than most of his business associates possessed, and felt ashamed of every meal he'd eaten without gratitude, every abundance he'd taken for granted. When their food arrived, somehow miraculously, the chef had managed to create elegant strips of perfectly seasoned chicken breast alongside James's salmon. Destiny clasped her hands together and bowed her head. "Thank you, God, for this food and for." She peeked up at James through her eyelashes. "What's your name?" "James," he said softly. "And for James," she continued, her eyes closed again. "Please keep Grandma Rose safe at work and help her not to worry about me. Amen." James felt his throat constrict. When was the last time someone had prayed for him? When was the last time he'd been grateful for anything beyond a successful acquisition or a profitable quarter? "That was beautiful," he managed. Destiny beamed and picked up her fork with careful precision. "Grandma Rose says we should always be thankful, even when things are hard. Especially when things are hard." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, James marveling at how this child could transform even the most elegant restaurant into something that felt like home. She ate slowly, savoring each bite with the appreciation of someone who understood that abundance wasn't guaranteed. "James," Destiny said, wiping her mouth with her napkin. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you sad? The question caught him completely off guard. In 42 years, no one had ever asked him that. Not directly. Not with the kind of pure concern that seemed to radiate from this child's dark eyes. What makes you think I'm sad? He asked carefully. Destiny tilted her head, studying him with that unsettling intensity he was beginning to recognize. Your eyes. They look like Grandma Rose's eyes when she thinks I'm not watching. Like you're carrying something heavy that you can't put down. The accuracy of her observation took his breath away. How could a 7-year-old see what countless therapists, business partners, and acquaintances had missed? Or perhaps they'd seen it and simply hadn't cared enough to ask. Yes, James admitted, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. I suppose I am sad. Why? Such a simple question. Such an impossible question. How could he explain decades of emotional armor to a child? How could he describe the way success had isolated him? The way wealth had become both shield and prison? I think, James said slowly, I forgot how to be happy. I spent so long trying to become someone important that I lost track of who I really was. Destiny nodded as if this made perfect sense. Like playing dress-up, but then you can't remember where you put your real clothes? The metaphor was so perfect, so devastatingly accurate, that James actually laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. Exactly like that. Grandma Rose says that happens sometimes. She says when people get hurt when they're little, sometimes they build walls to keep the hurt out, but then the walls keep the good stuff out too. James stared at this child, who somehow understood psychology better than his Harvard MBA classmates. Your grandmother sounds very wise. She is. She says I'm going to be wise too, when I grow up. She says I have an old soul. Destiny paused, then reached across the table and placed her small hand over his. You don't have to be sad forever, you know. Walls can come down. The touch of her hand, warm, trusting, completely without agenda, sent a shock through James's system. When was the last time someone had touched him without wanting something? When was the last time physical contact had been about comfort rather than transaction? Tell me about your grandmother, James said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. And Destiny did. She told him about Rose's garden on the fire escape, where she grew herbs in coffee cans because she couldn't afford proper pots. She described the way her grandmother hummed old gospel songs while braiding Destiny's hair, how she could make a feast from almost nothing, how she read the same 3 library books over and over because they were Destiny's favorites. With each story, James felt something loosening in his chest, some frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. This child spoke of poverty with such love, such warmth, that it transformed hardship into something beautiful. She found magic in small things, in the way sunlight caught in a soap bubble, in the sound of rain on their apartment's tin roof, in the smell of her grandmother's lavender lotion. She sounds like an amazing woman, James said when Destiny finished describing how Rose had taught her to dance to the radio in their tiny living room. She is. She's everything. Destiny's expression grew wistful. I just wish things weren't so hard for her. She tries to hide it, but I know she's tired. Really, really tired. The love in her voice, the mature concern for her grandmother's well-being, the way she carried worry that no 7-year-old should have to bear. It all served to highlight the stark contrast between her emotional richness and his spiritual poverty. Destiny, James said quietly, what do you want to be when you grow up? Her face lit up with dreams too big for their circumstances. A teacher, like Mrs. Patterson at school. She makes learning fun, and she always has crackers for kids who forget their lunch. I want to help kids learn things and make sure they're not hungry. James felt something crack open in his chest. This child, who had so little, dreamed of giving, who faced hunger daily and wanted to ensure other children were fed, who lived in poverty but aspired to wealth of spirit. I think, James said, his voice barely above a whisper, you're going to be an incredible teacher. Destiny smiled, and in that moment, James Wellington III, master of the universe, conqueror of markets, realized he was experiencing something he'd thought was lost forever. He was experiencing joy. Pure, uncomplicated, transformative joy in the company of another human being. And for the first time in decades, the empty chairs around him didn't feel like comfortable companions. They felt like missed opportunities for connection, for the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy, but that this remarkable child offered freely. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the restaurant, something beautiful was being born. The moment shattered like crystal against concrete. James's phone buzzed insistently against the table, its harsh vibration cutting through the gentle atmosphere they'd created. He glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice. Richard Blackstone, his biggest competitor, a man who'd spent the last 5 years trying to destroy Wellington Industries through any means necessary. "I have to take this," James said apologetically, but Destiny just smiled and nodded, turning her attention to carefully arranging the remaining chicken strips on her plate into a perfect star pattern. "Wellington," James answered, stepping away from the table. "Well, well," Blackstone's voice oozed false concern through the speaker. "Interesting dinner companion you have there, James. Very charitable of you." James's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want, Richard?" "Oh, I don't want anything. I'm just calling to congratulate you on your new publicity strategy. Taking homeless children to 5-star restaurants? Brilliant. Though I have to wonder what your board will think when they see tomorrow's headlines." Ice flooded James's veins. "What are you talking about? Check your email. I've sent you a preview of what Chicago Business Weekly will be running in their morning edition." Billionaire's bizarre breakdown. Wellington Industries CEO spotted dining with street child. Quite catchy, don't you think? With trembling fingers, James opened his email. The photos were crystal clear. Him holding Destiny's hand in the rain, her climbing into his car, the two of them walking into the restaurant together. But the captions were poison, twisting their connection into something sordid, suspicious, pathetic. "Where did you get these?" James whispered. "Oh, photographers are everywhere these days. Amazing what people will do for the right price. Your little charity case is about to become the most famous homeless child in Chicago. I do hope she's prepared for the scrutiny." The words hit James like physical blows. Scrutiny. Media attention. Reporters digging into Destiny's life, her grandmother's life, turning their private struggles into public entertainment. Child services asking questions. Social workers poking around. Their quiet dignity exposed and dissected by a hungry media machine. "You bastard," James breathed. Now. I'm simply a concerned citizen documenting the erratic behavior of a major corporate leader. The board of Wellington Industries deserves to know if their CEO is having some sort of mental breakdown, don't they? Taking homeless children to expensive restaurants, playing dress-up with little girls. It all looks quite questionable when presented in the right light. James's vision blurred with rage and terror. Not for himself, he could weather any media storm, survive any scandal. But Destiny, sweet, innocent Destiny who'd never asked for anything but companionship, she would be destroyed by this. Her life would become a circus, her privacy violated, her beautiful spirit crushed under the weight of unwanted attention. "What do you want?" James asked, though he already knew. "The Patterson Industries acquisition. Sign it over to me, and these photos disappear. The story gets killed. Your little friend goes back to her anonymous life of poverty. Everyone wins. The Patterson acquisition. 6 months of negotiations, a deal worth $3 billion, the cornerstone of James's expansion into renewable energy. His legacy deal. His pathway to leaving something meaningful behind. But as he looked across the restaurant at Destiny, who was now drawing hearts in the condensation on her water glass, completely unaware that her life was about to be torn apart, James realized that some things mattered more than legacy. "I need time to think," he said. "You have until midnight. After that, the story runs, and your little charity case becomes Chicago's most famous homeless child. I wonder how she'll handle the attention? Children can be so fragile under pressure." The line went dead. James stood frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, watching Destiny's innocent contentment and feeling his heart break into 1,000 pieces. She looked up and waved at him, her face radiant with simple joy, and he had to turn away before she could see the tears in his eyes. The restaurant suddenly felt too bright, too exposed, too dangerous. Every patron was a potential witness, every waiter a possible leak to the press. The golden warmth that had enveloped them now felt like a spotlight, harsh and revealing and threatening. When James returned to the table, Destiny immediately sensed the change in his mood. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her small brow furrowed with concern. "We need to go," James said, his voice coming out harsher than intended. "Now, did I do something wrong?" The question was small, uncertain, and it nearly destroyed him. "No," James said quickly, forcing gentleness into his voice. "You didn't do anything wrong. You could never do anything wrong. There's been a problem. A work problem." Destiny nodded solemnly, accepting his explanation with the trust of a child who'd learned to adapt quickly to adult emergencies. She carefully folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate, her movements precise despite her obvious confusion. As they prepared to leave, James caught Philippe's eye and nodded toward their table. "Charge everything to my account. And Philippe, this evening never happened." "Understood." Philippe nodded quickly, but James could see the calculation in his eyes. By morning, half of Chicago's elite would know about tonight. The story would spread like wildfire through the social circles that thrived on scandal and speculation. Outside, the storm had finally begun to subside, but James felt as if he were drowning. Each step toward his car was a step away from the connection he'd found, away from the joy he'd rediscovered, away from the man he'd briefly remembered he could be. Destiny climbed into the Bentley with careful reverence, her small hands stroking the leather seats with wonder. "This is really nice," she whispered. "Grandma Rose would love how soft these seats are." The innocent comment was a knife to James's heart, because he realized, with devastating clarity, that he could protect Destiny from the media storm, could save her from the scrutiny and judgment that would destroy her quiet life. But doing so would mean walking away from her forever. It would mean returning to his tower, to his empty meals and emptier victories, to the loneliness that had nearly killed his soul. And he wasn't sure he was strong enough to make that sacrifice, even if it was the right thing to do. The car pulled away from the restaurant, carrying them both toward a choice that would define not just James's character, but the rest of his life. The address Destiny had given him led to a housing project on Chicago's South Side that James had never seen despite living in the city for 15 years. As his Bentley navigated through streets lined with broken streetlights and boarded windows, he felt the weight of two worlds colliding, his world of privilege and power, and hers of struggle and resilience. "That's my building," Destiny said, pointing to a brick structure that had seen better decades. "Apartment 2B. Grandma Rose should be home from work by now." James pulled to the curb and turned off the engine. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, with the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted during that phone call at the restaurant. "Destiny," James began, then stopped. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that their friendship might destroy her life? How could he tell her that the simple act of sharing a meal had unleashed forces that could tear apart everything she held dear? "I know," she said quietly, her small hand finding his. "You're going to say goodbye, aren't you?" The perceptiveness of her observation gutted him. "How did you?" Your eyes got sad again. "After the phone call. The same kind of sad they were when I first saw you in the restaurant." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "It's okay. I understand." But she didn't understand. She couldn't. She was 7 years old and pure of heart, untouched by the cynical calculations that governed his world. She didn't know about media vultures or corporate warfare, or the way powerful men destroyed innocent lives for sport. "Destiny, there are people who want to hurt me by hurting you," James said carefully. "If we stay friends, if people see us together, they might try to make your life very difficult. They might bother you and your grandmother. They might. Are you ashamed of me?" The question was so quiet he almost missed it. "What?" No. The word exploded from him with startling force. Never. I could never be ashamed of you. You're the most remarkable person I've ever met. Destiny studied his face with those two wise eyes. Then why does it matter what other people think? Such a simple question. Such an impossible question. Why did it matter? Why should the opinions of strangers, the machinations of enemies, the judgment of a society that valued wealth over worth, why should any of that outweigh the pure connection he'd found with this extraordinary child? Because, James said slowly, sometimes caring about someone means protecting them, even if it hurts. Even if it hurts you too. Especially if it hurts me too. Destiny nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 7-year-old understanding of love and sacrifice. Grandma Rose says that sometimes loving someone means letting them go, even when you don't want to. The wisdom of it broke something inside James's chest. This child, who had so little, understood love better than he'd ever understood anything. Will you at least meet her? Destiny asked. Before you go. I told her about you, about how you weren't really eating alone anymore. She wants to thank you. James nodded, not trusting his voice. Together, they climbed the stairs to the second floor, past graffiti-covered walls and flickering fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh shadows. But when Destiny knocked on the door of 2B, the voice that answered was pure warmth. Destiny, baby, is that you? The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 60s, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with relief. Rose Johnson was smaller than James had imagined, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of battles fought and won through sheer force of will. Grandma Rose, Destiny said, launching herself into her grandmother's arms. This is James, the man I told you about. Rose's eyes found James over Destiny's head, and he saw her taking in his expensive suit, his polished shoes, the way he stood like someone unaccustomed to housing projects and narrow hallways. But there was no judgment in her gaze, only curiosity and a careful assessment that reminded him of her granddaughter's unsettling perceptiveness. Mr. Wellington, Rose said, extending a hand that was calloused from years of hard work, but warm with genuine welcome. Destiny told me you shared dinner with her tonight. That was very kind of you. Please call me James. And it was my privilege. Destiny is, she's extraordinary. Rose smiled, and James saw where Destiny had inherited her radiant warmth. She is that. Come in, please. I just made some tea. The apartment was tiny, maybe 400 square feet, but it was spotless and filled with love. Books were stacked on every available surface. Destiny's artwork covered the walls, and the smell of lavender, that dollar store lotion Destiny had mentioned, permeated everything. It was poverty transformed by love into something beautiful. They sat around a small table that served as both dining space and homework desk, sipping tea from mismatched cups while Destiny recounted every detail of their evening together. James watched Rose's face as her granddaughter spoke, saw the way love and worry warred in her expression. She talks about you like you're some kind of guardian angel, Rose said when Destiny went to change out of her rain-soaked clothes. Says you looked lonely and needed a friend. She was right, James admitted. I was lonely. I am lonely. But being her friend puts her in danger, and I can't. What kind of danger? Rose's voice sharpened with protective instinct. James explained, haltingly, about the photos and the threats and the media attention that would descend on their quiet life like a plague of locusts. He watched Rose's face pale as she understood the implications, saw her grandmother's heart break as she realized what their simple kindness might cost. So you're walking away, Rose said when he finished. It wasn't a question. To protect her. To protect both of you. Rose was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You know, Mr. Wellington, James, I've spent my whole life protecting that little girl. From hunger, from cold, from the harshness of a world that doesn't much care about children like her. But tonight, for the first time in months, she came home happy. Really, truly happy. She found something in you that I can't give her. Hope that the world isn't as cruel as it seems. Tears tracked down Rose's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. If you walk away now, you teach her that hope is dangerous, that caring about people leads to heartbreak, that the world really is as cruel as it seems. James felt his carefully constructed resolve crumbling. But if you stay, you teach her that some things are worth fighting for, that love doesn't always end in loss, that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Destiny appeared in the doorway, now dressed in pajamas that had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent. She looked between the two adults, reading the tension in the room with that unsettling wisdom. "You're still going to leave, aren't you?" she asked James. James looked at this remarkable child, at her grandmother who'd raised her with nothing but love and determination, at the tiny apartment that contained more warmth than his penthouse ever had. He thought about Blackstone's ultimatum, about the media storm that would follow, about the choice between his empire and his soul. And for the first time in 32 years, James Wellington III chose love over fear. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm not going anywhere." 3 months later, James Wellington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching Chicago's skyline glitter in the winter morning sun. But unlike the countless mornings before, he wasn't alone. Behind him, seated at a small table he had installed near his desk, 7-year-old Destiny Johnson worked diligently on her homework, her tongue poking out in concentration as she practiced writing her letters. The media storm that had followed Blackstone's revelation had been every bit as vicious as James had feared. Chicago Business Weekly had run the photos with headlines designed to destroy, and other outlets had quickly followed suit. The speculation had been merciless, everything from accusations of impropriety to suggestions that James was having a mental breakdown. But something unexpected had happened. Instead of hiding from the storm, James had walked directly into it. He'd called a press conference the morning after Blackstone's ultimatum. Standing before a room full of skeptical reporters, he'd told the truth, all of it. He'd spoken about his own childhood poverty, about the foster homes and the hunger that had driven him to build his empire. He'd talked about meeting Destiny, about how a simple question from a homeless child had reminded him what it meant to be human. "Her name is Destiny Johnson," he'd said, looking directly into the cameras. "She's 7 years old, she's brilliant, and she's taught me more about success in one evening than I learned in 20 years of business school. If that makes me unfit to run a company, then so be it. But I won't apologize for remembering how to care about someone other than myself." The response had been swift and polarizing. Some board members had called for his removal. Competitors had circled like sharks, sensing weakness. Stock prices had fluctuated wildly as investors tried to decide whether James Wellington had lost his mind or found his soul. But other voices had emerged too. Employees who'd worked for Wellington Industries for decades spoke about James's fairness, his integrity, his ability to build something lasting. Community leaders praised his charitable giving. And slowly, surprisingly, public opinion began to shift. The turning point had come when Rose Johnson agreed to an interview with Chicago's most respected news anchor. Sitting in their tiny apartment, she'd spoken with quiet dignity about her granddaughter, about their struggles, about the night a billionaire had seen past their poverty to their humanity. "He didn't give us money," she'd said, her voice steady despite the cameras. "He gave us something more valuable. He gave us respect. He saw my granddaughter as a person, not a problem. And when powerful people tried to use our friendship against him, he chose us over his own safety. That's not a man having a breakdown. That's a man becoming who he was always meant to be." The interview had gone viral. Support had poured in from unexpected corners. Teachers who worked with underprivileged children, social workers who understood the daily challenges Rose and Destiny faced, ordinary people who recognized authentic human connection when they saw it. Blackstone's extortion attempt had backfired spectacularly. When the full story emerged, the threats, the manipulation, the attempt to use a child as a weapon, public outrage had been swift and decisive. Wellington Industries stock had rebounded stronger than ever. while Blackstone found himself facing SEC investigations and a public relations nightmare from which his company never recovered. But the real transformation hadn't happened in boardrooms or stock markets. It had happened in James's heart. James. Destiny's voice pulled him from his memories. I finished my math worksheet. Wanna see? He turned from the window, smiling at the sight of her small figure dwarfed by the executive chair he'd had specially adjusted for her height. 3 mornings a week, she came to the office with him while Rose worked her day shift at a new job, managing the wellness center that Wellington Industries had opened in their neighborhood. It was an arrangement that had scandalized some and inspired others, but James no longer cared about other people's opinions. Let me see, he said, settling into the chair beside her. The math problems were perfect, each number carefully formed in her precise handwriting. Excellent work, as always. Destiny beamed, then grew serious. James, Mrs. Patterson says I'm reading at a 5th grade level now. Do you think I could really be a teacher someday? The hope in her voice, the careful way she asked the question as if afraid the dream might be too big for someone like her, made James's chest tight with emotion. Destiny, he said, taking her small hands in his. I think you can be anything you want to be. And when you're ready for college, there's a scholarship with your name on it. She threw her arms around his neck, her joy infectious and pure. Really? In fact, I've been thinking about starting a foundation. The Destiny Johnson Educational Foundation. What do you think? Her eyes went wide. You'd name it after me? You changed my life, James said simply. It seems only fair that you get to change other lives too. The intercom buzzed, and his assistant's voice filled the office. Mr. Wellington? Mrs. Johnson is here to pick up Destiny. Send her in, James said. Rose appeared in the doorway, her face bright with the health and happiness that had bloomed since she'd started her new job. At 68, she'd discovered a passion for helping others that had transformed her from a tired cleaning lady into a beloved community advocate. How was school today, sunshine baby? She asked, opening her arms for Destiny's enthusiastic hug. Great. And James said he's going to start a foundation with my name. Rose's eyes met James's over Destiny's head, shining with gratitude and something deeper. The recognition of a promise kept, a life transformed, a future secured. As they prepared to leave, Destiny turned back to James with that expression he'd come to treasure. Pure affection unmarked by calculation or agenda. Can I eat with you tomorrow? She asked, echoing the question that had started it all. James smiled, his heart full in ways he'd never imagined possible. Always, he said. You can always eat with me. As they left, Rose pausing to squeeze his hand in silent thanks, James returned to his window. But now, instead of seeing a kingdom conquered, he saw a city full of possibilities. Somewhere out there were other children like Destiny, other grandmothers like Rose, other chances for connection and redemption and love. His empire was still vast, his bank account still astronomical, his business success still legendary. But for the first time in his life, James Wellington III was truly wealthy. Because he'd learned that the richest man in the room isn't the one who has the most money. It's the one who has someone to share it with. Someone who sees past the trappings of success to the human heart beneath. Someone who asks, with perfect innocence and infinite hope, "Can I eat with you?" And in learning to say yes, really truly yes, James had found not just friendship but redemption. Not just connection, but transformation. Not just love, but the courage to become the man he'd always been meant to be. The little black girl's question had indeed broken the billionaire's heart. And in breaking, it had finally learned how to heal. What lessons about love, connection, and the courage to be vulnerable will you carry with you from James and Destiny's story?